Good afternoon, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with my colleague, Senator Ben Cardin, to share in the talking about the release of Alan Gross, one of our Maryland constituents who had been held unjustly in a Cuban prison for 5 years. Senator Cardin, we're at the tarmac today to welcome Alan Gross home. This was a culmination of our effort for more than 5 years to bring him home and to get him home safely. Yesterday, I received a call from Vice President Biden informing me that Mr. Gross would leave Cuba this morning as part of an overall spy swap, and that it also would be the beginning of new policy changes for Cuba. I was delighted to hear both. It is time. But for me, the big moment was Alan Gross. To be out at the tarmac, to see a plane that says the United States of America wing through the sky, and to know that Mr. Gross and his beloved wife Judy were on that plane, and to see the doors open, and to see his wife that we had worked with. We had stood from meetings to phone calls to outreach efforts to passing of congressional resolutions, to see Judy walk down with the biggest smile that I have seen in 5 years, only then to be followed by a slender man who I feared would come down halting, because we knew he'd been so sick that he'd lost 100 pounds. And there came Alan Gross, erect, coming down those steps, and watching his feet touch the United States of America was for me indeed an emotional year. For 5 years, we have worked with his wife Judy, his daughters Nina and Shara, to try to get his release. The story of Alan is the story of people who are dedicated, who serve America. He was an AID contractor. He had devoted his life to trying to help people in other countries to be empowered. He had taken the internet to Cuba to help get senior citizens connected, so maybe they could talk back and forth to their relatives in the United States of America. They were primarily Jewish, they were primarily old, but Castro decided that Alan was a spy, and he ended up in prison, he ended up in isolation, he ended up enduring incredible hardship. Well, we teamed together. Judy came to us to help us as she went to other members of Congress. Senator Cardin will talk about our efforts, but we reached out, we passed congressional records and congressional statements. We passed 3 congressional resolutions calling for his release. We had meetings with the White House. We had letters to the White House, letters to the Cuban government. Senator Cardin and I and Chris Van Hollen and Dick Durbin even visited the papal nuncio in Washington when Pope Benedict was coming, to get him on the Vatican pipeline to speak for human rights and humanitarian releases. Well, we got a new pope. He also put it in the Vatican pipeline, and whatever pipeline Pope Francis has to whatever higher power, and whatever power President Obama could use, we now have Alan Gross home. It is a great day. Alan is now with his wife Judy. They'll be at home recuperating and receiving medical evaluations. We're going to be able to work with him, and while Alan is recovering, we will be moving on to new policy days in the future to normalize diplomatic travel and other relationships with Cuba. I look forward to supporting the president in that endeavor. I do think it's time, and now it's time for me to call in Senator Cardin.
Well, let me thank Senator Mikulski for the successful strategies of elevating Alan Gross' case over the past 5 years until we could reach this moment. And I must tell you, at Andrews today, to see Alan Gross come back to the United States and touch foot in Maryland, it was a very emotional moment. recognizing that Alan Gross will be celebrating the first day of Hanukkah with his family. Hanukkah is the festival of rededication, it's the festival of lights. It's also the festival that celebrates a miracle. And Alan Gross being home is, I think, an appropriate that it occurred on the first day of Hanukkah. And we talked about that. I had a chance to talk, as we all did, with Alan Gross. And as Senator Mikulski pointed out, I was extremely impressed by his attitude and his being in good spirits. He talked openly about the Cuban people and that they're good people. But obviously their government has fallen short in so many different ways. And he was very clear about that. So today's a day to celebrate that Alan Gross is home, to celebrate that we're moving towards more normal relations with Cuba. And the work that went through points out to me that when you're fighting for human rights, you can't be quiet about it. And Senator Mikulski led several efforts at times when we had the ear of people that could do something about it, whether it was U.S. officials or whether it was Cuban officials or whether it was from the Vatican, and made it clear, and we all made it clear, that this case had to be addressed and Alan Gross had to be released. So the strategy of letters, the strategies of resolutions, the strategies of conversation, all are critically important to make sure those who are unjustly treated, that justice prevails. And yes, I am pleased that we're moving towards a better relationship with Cuba. But it doesn't change the fact that Cuba is a communist government. It doesn't change the fact that Cuba does violate the human rights of its citizens. And we will continue to speak out about that. We're not going to be quiet about it. We're going to talk about basic human rights and values, and we will use the appropriate way to try to make changes in that regard. As President Obama said, the United States holds diplomatic relations with China and Vietnam, both communist countries. So we know that there are problems around the world, but our engagement, we think, will help resolve those cases, and we will continue to put spotlights on those issues. I was interested in my conversation with Alan Gross, where he sort of mentioned that. And he says, "Well, yeah, I'm pleased we're improving our relationships with Cuba, but there's still changes that has to take place in Cuba, and we all understand that, and we're all going to work for those types of changes on behalf of the people of Cuba."